Good morning. This is ThinkTech Talks here on Ustream.tv and Spreaker.com. And we are ThinkTech Hawaii doing a story about The Nation. TheNation.com is a magazine that we have all known since our childhood, which has gone on the web as TheNation.com. And we have a reporter from The Nation who is Kristen Gwynne, Gwynne, who has written an article in this week's edition of The Nation dealing with marijuana in the United States. And the title of her article is, "Will Medical Pot Survive? The legalization in Washington state has led to parallel marijuana industries. Is there room for both?" Welcome to ThinkTech, Kristen Gwynne.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. So tell us about the Nation in general. How is it doing? What's its online presence? And this particular issue. I'd like to know about this issue and the focus on marijuana.
The Nation is a historic left-leaning periodical. It's actually the longest running in America, and I think its web presence is growing now, as it has some really great writers who are blogging, like Michael Denzel Smith, who writes on race. The Nation does have a bit of an older audience, but I'm hoping that with this issue, they'll attract some younger people and be able to spread their word more widely.
I think it certainly will. And you're talking to us on Skype, what, from New York City?
Yes.
Which is the headquarters for TheNation.com. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, Kristen, tell me about this particular edition of The Nation. It looks like most or all of the articles in this edition deal with marijuana. What's the general, intent of that? What's the general message of it?
The general message, as their editor-in-chief Katrina wrote, is that it's always been time to legalize marijuana, and a big part of this issue is that legalizing marijuana is a fight for racial justice. There are several articles in there describing the disparity in marijuana arrests, why legalizing it is important for achieving not just criminal justice and equality, but also social justice. We see when people are arrested for marijuana, they lose a lot of access to things like employment, housing, and even education. You can lose federal grants for student loans. And so when we see these resources being stripped, particularly from people of color because of marijuana arrests, we know that there's a problem. And so that's a big part of this issue.
Yeah, I see an article by Carl Hart, Pot Reform's Race Problem. And so you really, or Martin Lee's article, Let a Thousand Flowers Bloom. You've got it coming from all sides on this issue. It apparently dedicated to an editorial position that marijuana should be decriminalized all over the country, yeah?
Yeah. And it's a movement that we're seeing the states lead. So it's important to look at what's happening right now in Washington and Colorado and use them as formats for how to move forward. So other states right now are watching to see what's going to happen and wondering, will the feds intervene? Will this work? Will use rates go up, particularly among youths? And so the regulations that have been put in place to deal with these concerns are important as other states and even nations across the world are waiting to see how everything will play out.
Well, let's start with Colorado. Colorado has been decriminalized, for a year or two now?
Yeah, and it was November, the last election was when they passed the legalization initiative, just like along with Washington, making them the first two, not just states in America, but places in the world to do so.
And Washington is, the Washington statute was passed, but it doesn't go into effect until what? January 1st of 2014.
Right, well that's when we'll see the regulations and the stores opening. But in the meantime, it's still not a crime to be caught with marijuana. Possession is no longer illegal for adults older than 21. What's interesting now, though, is that sale is still illegal while people are being licensed and the regulations are being finalized.
So that means that I can possess it, I can get a license to sell it, but I can't actually sell it.
Yes.
So everybody has to wait for 60 days.
Yes, well, this summer is actually when they'll see stores opening up. So it will actually take a little bit longer.
Okay. So what are the regulations all about? I mean, who's writing them and what are they likely to say?
Allison Holcomb of the ACLU, she was a big player in coming up with the regulations. The Liquor Control Board is the body that's going to oversee the regulations and enforce them. And basically, Washington has a stricter model than Colorado because it doesn't allow home grow, and it only allows like a person who wants to sell marijuana to own 3 stores. So the point of the regulations in Washington are to move away from the kind of big tobacco or beer industry model and aim for something smaller. And it's also, in Washington, they're really trying to create regulations to deal with people's concerns about marijuana being driven out of state or to youth and things like that. And a big part of that is the age limit. You know, you have to be 21. It's not 18. But the problem is that for medical marijuana in Washington, you had to be 18. And so now there's this small group of people who are between 18 and 21 who maybe had a medical marijuana prescription and are now wondering what that means for them, because the same group that is passing these regulations is now recommending additional regulations to the next legislator. And what they're recommending is basically to do away with medical marijuana altogether, because the belief is that if you have legalized marijuana, it will be selling the same product that you would have in a medical marijuana store. So they're saying, you know, it would just be an issue of marketing to help medical marijuana patients. But the medical marijuana industry, however, is concerned particularly about youths 18 to 21, and also if the legal market will maintain a medical aesthetic, and if they're really going to care and be as invested in selling marijuana that shows their therapeutic or medically beneficial effects as opposed to marijuana that someone would just like to use for fun.
Well, I've seen some articles in the last few days in other publications raising the question as to whether whether marijuana has medical benefits. And it was, at least in the article that I saw, it wasn't clearly established that marijuana did have medical benefits. That's not dispositive, but certainly it's an issue. I mean, what are the medical benefits that we are talking about here, at least as far as this discussion is concerned?
Well, some of the most obvious ones are reduction of nausea, which is important to, you know, people, just whether you're suffering from a stomach bug or you have cancer or you are an AIDS patient made sick by your medications. Medical marijuana has helped people who were suffering from anorexia due to these afflictions actually be able to eat, and that's a really important benefit of marijuana that has been well established. Then there are other ones like the ability of a marijuana component called CBD to interfere with seizure disorders, and that's where we saw Sanjay Gupta on CNN talk about a little girl named Charlotte and the medical marijuana she was using called Charlotte's Web. And that marijuana was very low in THC, which is the psychoactive property in marijuana that actually makes you feel high, but high in CBD, which actually mitigates the effects of THC and makes a person feel calmer, and does have the medical benefits that people attribute to marijuana as a drug in general. Even opponents to marijuana and medical marijuana, like Kevin Zbet, who was an advisor to the Obama administration, he acknowledges that CBD is medically beneficial. But the problem with him and people who share that point of view is that they ignore evidence that shows CBD is most effective in combination with lower amounts of THC. So what we need to do is more research to figure out the proper ratio of CBD to THC and how that works for different illnesses and different symptoms that people are working to control. Now, the problem with doing additional research is that the federal government often blocks that research. They'll approve, for example, a study, but then the National Institute of Drug Abuse will not actually provide them with the marijuana that they need to do that study.
It's hard to do research without anything to research.
Exactly.
So, you know, but if you change the law to allow marijuana in general at the age of 18, then this would be a moot discussion, wouldn't it? Then you wouldn't care if it was medical marijuana or not, because everyone over the age of 18 could use it. Am I right?
Well, you'd have to ask people in the medical marijuana industry. There are other reasons why they are against legalization. Actually, in Washington State, some medical marijuana activists were against full legalization, and that's because medical marijuana is less regulated. It kind of exists through a loophole. So, for example, under I-502, the legalization law in Washington, you can only have 3 stores, like I said. But for a medical marijuana dispensary, you could have as many as you want. Also, there's no body overseeing medical marijuana, like the Liquor Control Board. So it was a lot easier to kind of slip through the cracks and not pay taxes and things like that. So, but there are other people who are in the medical marijuana industry that are excited about legalization and actually want more regulation and want to be transparent. And so, really, the question will be whether the medical marijuana industry will accept these regulations and show that that's what they want to do, is become a legitimate industry, or if they want to kind of stay in the shadows.
How interesting. So this is what you mean by the title of the article, that the legislation in Washington State has led to parallel industries, that is medical marijuana and not medical marijuana, or all marijuana, and then you pose the question, is there room for both? So Kristen, what is your answer to the question? Is there room for both?
I think that there's room for both, and right now they need to have both, because it's not entirely clear whether the amount of marijuana that has been allowed to be produced under I-502 is enough to serve the entire market. So long as medical marijuana dispensaries stay open, it should be enough, but the problem is that if there isn't enough in 502, and then you shut down the medical marijuana dispensaries, you make room for black market marijuana.
Okay. Well, do you think it needs further legislation going forward?
Definitely. I mean, further legislation is what would save medical marijuana in Washington State. The lack of it is what has actually made it vulnerable to federal intervention. A lot of these raids were kind of framed by the media as orchestrated by Obama from the White House. And that's just really a ridiculous accusation. A lot of times what happens was there were complaints from the community about a medical marijuana dispensary that was not acting lawfully, and people were concerned, and then there was no body that could go in there and make sure that they were following the law and hold them responsible. So more regulations would actually help the medical marijuana industry, so long as they're not regulated out of existence.
Well, it sounded from one thing you said in the article, which I think was something along the lines that the U.S. attorneys in various jurisdictions, that is in Colorado and in Washington, could make up their minds as to whether to raid or prosecute a particular situation individually, and that there was no, I got from that there was no policy exactly around the country from the administration on exactly when and how and what to do about raiding or prosecuting marijuana in states that permit marijuana. What's your take on that?
Well, through memos and public statements, the Obama administration has made clear that they don't want to use their resources going after medical or fully legal marijuana in states that have legalized it. But what they do tell attorneys to do, and they give them their blessing, is to go after dispensaries or stores that are not following the state regulations. And so that's been their policy, and that is really what a lot of these U.S. attorneys are doing.
Is that a workable policy for for the country, for other states that legalize marijuana, like Colorado and Washington?
I don't think so. I don't think it's good to have federal intervention in these kind of statewide experiments. But what Washington is doing that's really smart is having the Liquor Control Board be the body that oversees it. So when you have someone else that's willing to step in and say you're operating outside of the state law, you are not following the will of the voters, and then they are the ones who step in and either file charges or recommend something else be done, then that's a lot better, and I think it makes the communities who voted for these laws feel more like they understand what's happening.
Well, so where are we going on this? It seems like ultimately all states, at least in your view and in the view of many others, should decriminalize marijuana, and the federal government should likewise decriminalize it and let the states handle it. What's your position on that?
I agree with that, and I think that is the direction in which we're moving. Poll after poll finds that the majority of Americans now support marijuana legalization, especially medical. You'd be hard-pressed to find large amounts of people in states saying that they don't believe that a person who is sick should have access to medical marijuana, particularly when you see so many people using dangerous prescription drugs like painkillers.
Sure.
So I think that this is it's a time for change, and we are moving in the direction of change, and we're going to see more states legalize marijuana and medical marijuana, and I think it's just going to be a statewide effort that the federal government will have to respond to eventually. So long as marijuana is classified by the federal government as a Schedule I drug, they reserve the right to go in and make arrests, but they don't have the resources to do that. So it's unrealistic to think that if it stays illegal on under federal grounds, that it would be a huge threat should the majority of states legalize it. But we do need to figure out a way for the federal government to respond to these states that are legalizing it in a way that is constructive, and that would probably be by rescheduling marijuana and taking it out of the Controlled Substance Act Schedule I category.
Yeah, it sounds like that's the least that the federal government should do, in anticipation that, well, in view of the fact that some states have made it legal, and there's sort of this kind of inherent conflict now, the federal government should, make it legal or leave it in the hands of the states so that they're not in conflict with any laws in the state of Colorado or Washington. I wonder what's going to happen now. Are laws in other states in the pipeline? Are you following other states that are adopting or about to adopt the same kind of legislation? Will that legislation be the same? Will it have two tracks also?
Oregon is one state that's looking to legalize marijuana actually this month by ballot initiative. And their model is a little bit different from Washington's, for example, because Washington's law contains a per se DUID limit, it's called, and basically it establishes that at a certain amount of THC per milliliter of blood, you are intoxicated and could be charged with driving under the influence of drugs. A lot of people argue that this limit is too low, and that people who smoke marijuana often and then thus have THC built up in their systems could be driving and totally fine, and then under this law be slammed with a DUI. In Oregon, you won't see that. Also, Oregon, New Approach Oregon, the group behind it, is saying that they are not willing to compromise on home growing like Washington did. So you will see the ability to home grow there. Washington actually had the most conservative approach to marijuana legalization that I think has ever been drafted. So you'll probably see, as states move forward, less regulation actually, and more of an ability to allow people to, grow for themselves, or maybe drive at an acceptable limit. But the problem with the DUID standard is that people who are against marijuana or drinking and driving don't, and just, a lot of common sense people in general don't want people driving while they're high. And so we do need to figure out a better way maybe to determine whether or not someone is too intoxicated to drive on marijuana.
Sure, especially if they cross a state border into a state where it's not, there is no law decriminalizing marijuana. And it also suggests there are all kinds of, transitional issues interstate issues, what have you, the differences between the laws in the various states. We're only beginning to develop a whole new body of law now, state law about this from state to state, different statutes, different regulations, different gloss. Wouldn't it be simpler if the federal government just continued to handle this but decriminalized it?
It would probably be simpler, but I'm not sure that we can count on that. Or that we have the momentum to do that right now. But there are some like pockets of America and some states that might not be ready for marijuana legalization. But meanwhile, in other states like Oregon and Washington and Colorado, they've been moving towards this for a long time. So the work is being done in parts of the country, and I think as they lead the way and really provide an example of what a regulated marijuana market looks like compared to the black market, states that maybe were more on the fence about it will come to terms with the idea that this is actually a safer idea, that marijuana legalization is good for communities and good for children, and is actually a policy that keeps communities safe. Yes.
Well, if I'm an entrepreneur and I'd like to consider moving to Washington in order to sell marijuana, what do I have to do? When can I come and do that? What do I have to do in order to qualify?
You would have to basically just apply for a license. You would have to say whether or not you wanted to be a distributor or processor or retail. And then, I mean, you wait, and I'm sure there's not exactly sure how intense the application process is, but I think if you can prove that, you know, you have the money and everything you need in order to make this operation work set up, it should then, if you should be able to do it.
Suppose I'm a tourist. Suppose I'm planning on visiting the Pacific Northwest. When should I make my plans to go? And how much trouble will it be for me to get a joint?
Well, there is no law in Washington restricting marijuana access to residents of the state. So tourists could actually go there and buy marijuana just like everyone else, assuming that they're 21 years or older. And if you are someone who wants to go there for marijuana tourism, I would suggest waiting until maybe this summer, a little bit later in the fall, because as the stores are opening, things have been kind of taking longer than people would have liked, kind of moving at a slow rate to get everyone licensed and everything set up. So it's supposed to be, this summer, there are supposed to be 300 stores that will open in Washington State. So I would say anytime after then.
Well, what do I have to do to get arrested? You know, what mistakes could I make that wind up, where I'll wind up in jail?
Smoking on the street would get you a ticket. That's still illegal. It's just like having an open container of alcohol, although it has been a low police priority for years in Seattle, for example. So the chances of that being enforced upon you would probably be slim unless you were right in front of a police officer. You can't sell it on the street. Don't get caught buying and then selling to someone else, particularly someone who is underage. That is what the police seem to be most concerned about.
Well, this is great. You must be encouraged by all this. You know, this is taking a good position on a good issue, and certainly maybe even having an effect on the national trend in that direction. How do you feel about it, Kristen?
I think it's really exciting. I come from a law enforcement family, so it's interesting to see the Seattle Police Department really organizing around this as a way to connect to the communities. I think it will, in terms of policing, have a huge impact, not just in these states but elsewhere, as marijuana, and because it smells, is one of the most often cited reasons for police officers to search someone or their car. And I think that as we move forward and more states follow this trend, hopefully we'll see a reduction in this kind of drug war policing that has turned police departments into basically just military.
Yeah. Well, what about Hawaii? You think Hawaii should be in the pipeline? I mean, I can tell you there are people here in Hawaii who do have a smoke once in a while. And I'm wondering where Hawaii fits. Have any sense of that?
Well, Hawaii did give us Barack Obama, and while he was in Washington, we know that he was participating in the Choom Gang. His friends with whom he loved to smoke marijuana, and even had plenty of silly terms that he would use for taking it from someone else, for example, like an interception, I think is what Obama called it. So if the Choom Gang's around and they're still down, I think you have that.
Okay, well, this is a great issue. And how can I go? I can go online and just find thenation.com and sign up and read your article, eh?
Yes, if you go to current issue, you'll see all the articles there, and mine is available in front of the paywall now.
Okay, and what's the next issue? When's it coming out, and will it deal with another, one issue kind of spate of articles in the same way, or will it be various different articles next time?
I don't know. I'm not involved in the next issue, but it will be the following week, and usually there is somewhat of a theme. Probably not as exciting as marijuana this time. I don't know if you'll get as cool of a cover. This cover is the Choom Gang with a very young Barack Obama.
Kristen Gwynne of The Nation, thank you so much for joining us on ThinkTech. I hope we can talk again soon.
Thank you for having me.
Aloha.